At 5 a.m., an obese single father and his daughter witnessed a scene that would change their lives forever. A flipped police cruiser was engulfed in flames. Arthur, who shouldn't even be there, did the most reckless thing of his life. He left his daughter behind and rushed into the inferno to save the trapped officer. But this seemingly heroic act would soon make him the prime suspect. The mastermind hiding behind the crime scene had just altered Arthur's fate. But he had no idea who he was messing with, and that this 300-pound man was holding something that would shock the entire police force. The most spectacular hunt has just begun, and every knot will be untied in the final minutes. Before we uncover the truth, where are you tuning in from? Leave your location in the comments so I know we're on this journey together. At 5:12 a.m., the city streets were entirely empty. Arthur sat heavily behind the massive steering wheel of the garbage truck, adjusted the rear-view mirror, and quietly looked at his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, who was fast asleep. She was curled up tightly in the passenger seat around a worn-out stuffed bear. A faded moving blanket covered her small shoulders. Arthur let out a slow, quiet breath. He never wanted this life for her. Just 3 years ago, things were different. Before his wife's sudden passing, Arthur had a steady job at a local logistics company. But grief was a heavy anchor. When she died, something inside him simply broke. The crushing weight of depression crept in, slowly taking over his daily routine. He stopped going out. He stopped taking care of himself. The weight piled on until he reached 300 pounds. The logistics company let him go, citing his declining health and unkempt appearance. Doors slammed in his face wherever he applied. No one wanted to hire a massive, unpolished man who looked like he had given up on life. The only place that didn't care about his appearance was the city sanitation department. It was backbreaking, thankless work, but it put food on the table for Lily. Arthur shook his head, trying to clear the painful memories. He reached over and gently pulled the blanket higher over Lily's sleeping form. Suddenly, a pair of blinding headlights pierced through the dense morning fog. Arthur squinted against the glare. The screech of burning rubber shattered the quiet morning, instantly followed by a sickening crunch of tearing metal. The ground beneath the massive garbage truck shook violently. Instinct took over. Arthur slammed his heavy work boots down on the brake pedal. He threw his massive right arm across the passenger seat, pinning Lily against the worn leather backrest to brace her from the impact. The 20-ton garbage truck skidded across the icy asphalt, the tires screaming in protest. The heavy vehicle swerved sharply, the rear wheels kicking up dirt as it nearly plunged into a deep drainage ditch before finally jolting to a complete stop. Lily woke up gasping, her tiny hands clutching her stuffed bear. "Daddy, what happened?" Arthur didn't answer right away. He stared through the cracked windshield. Thick, black smoke was already billowing into the freezing air just 50 yards ahead. A vehicle was lying upside down, its undercarriage completely crushed. But as the flames licked higher, Arthur noticed the distinct paint job. It wasn't a normal civilian car, it was a city police cruiser. But what he didn't know was that a few extra seconds of hesitation here would soon force him to relive the worst nightmare of his entire life. "Stay in the truck, Lily. Don't unbuckle your seatbelt," Arthur ordered, his voice trembling slightly. He kicked his door open and hit the freezing pavement. The smell of raw gasoline was overpowering. As Arthur sprinted toward the flipped cruiser, his heavy boots pounded against the asphalt. The heat from the growing fire hit his face like a physical wall. He dropped to his knees beside the shattered driver's side window. A female officer was trapped upside down, held entirely by her seatbelt. Her face was covered in blood, and she was completely unconscious. Arthur reached for the mangled door handle, but he froze. The flames were creeping closer to the ruptured gas tank. But it wasn't the fire that stopped him. It was the memory of the cold concrete wall from 1 year ago. The suspicious eyes of the cops, the humiliating pat-down. It was a memory that still burned in his chest. 1 year ago, Arthur had stepped in to pull a teenager out of a wrecked sedan. Instead of being thanked, the arriving police officers took one look at his dirty, oversized clothes and immediately pinned him against a wall. They questioned him for 2 hours, treating him like a violent vagrant who had caused the crash. The body shaming, the suspicious glares, the absolute humiliation, it taught Arthur a bitter lesson. In this world, heroes wore crisp uniforms. Men who looked like him were only seen as threats. In that moment, he hesitated. If I pull her out, he thought, they're going to see a giant, dirty man standing over an injured cop. They're going to think I did this. The psychological grip of his past trauma paralyzed him. If he saved her and got arrested, who would take care of Lily? If he went to jail just for looking like a criminal, his daughter would end up in the system. He took a step back. The safest thing to do was to walk away. Just call 911 and hide. Then Arthur looked back at the garbage truck. Through the dirty windshield, he saw Lily's small, terrified eyes watching him. In that split second, the words of his late wife echoed clearly in his mind. A true hero isn't the man in the spotless uniform. It's the one willing to burn his hands when everyone else walks away. Arthur clenched his jaw. He refused to let fear dictate his actions. He refused to let his daughter watch her father walk away from someone in need. Grit replacing fear, Arthur turned back to the burning cruiser. The door frame was completely crushed, wedged tight against the asphalt. Normal strength couldn't move it, but Arthur wasn't a normal man. He wedged his massive calloused fingers into the tiny gap between the door and the frame. The metal was already glowing hot, searing his skin. He ignored the blistering pain. He planted his heavy boots firmly on the ground, took a deep breath of the toxic smoke and pulled. The muscles in his back and shoulders strained against his soaked work shirt. He let out a primal grunt. The sound of metal screeching and snapping filled the air as Arthur's 300-pound frame forced the heavy armored door open. With 11 seconds before the gas tank went up, Arthur reached in, unclipped her seatbelt, and dragged the unconscious officer out of the wreckage. He shielded her body with his own massive frame just as the cruiser exploded. The blast wave pushed them forward, raining hot debris across the street. Arthur lay on the asphalt, gasping for air. His hands were cracked, bleeding, and covered in severe burns. He looked down at the officer, checking her pulse. She was alive. He had done it. But before he could even stand up, the piercing wail of approaching sirens flooded the street. Within seconds, 3 police cruisers skidded to a halt around him, blocking him from his garbage truck. Red and blue lights flashed aggressively against the dark morning fog. Doors flew open, and multiple officers drew their weapons, aiming directly at the massive, soot-covered man standing over their bleeding colleague. Arthur raised his blistered hands. The nightmare had just repeated itself. And from the shadows not far away, a pair of cold eyes was silently watching everything. The mastermind behind this crash was preparing to set an even more vicious trap. Before Arthur could even utter a single word to explain, a heavy, brutal force slammed into his back. An enraged police officer tackled him onto the freezing asphalt. The impact knocked the wind out of his massive lungs, his cheeks scraping against the rough, icy road. "Don't move! Put your hands behind your back!" the officer screamed, aggressively pressing a knee into the center of Arthur's spine. In the dim, chaotic light of the early morning, the scene looked damning. Arthur's oversized, frayed work clothes were covered in thick black soot from the explosion. His large, heavily blistered hands were stained with the unconscious female officer's blood. As emergency paramedics rushed past him to load the critically injured cop onto a stretcher, the arriving officers took one look at Arthur's intimidating 300-pound size and unkempt appearance, immediately concluding he was the vicious attacker. "Daddy!" a shrill, terrified voice pierced through the wailing sirens. Arthur wrenched his neck to the side, ignoring the knee digging into his back. Little Lily was standing by the open door of the massive garbage truck. She was clutching her worn-out stuffed bear to her chest, crying hysterically as she watched multiple armed officers pin her father to the ground like an animal. Arthur's heart shattered into a million pieces. The absolute worst nightmare of his life had just come true. He had just risked his own life, burning his own flesh to save a dying woman, and now he was being treated like human trash. Rough, unforgiving hands grabbed his severely burned wrists. Arthur gritted his teeth, his jaw trembling as he held back a raw roar of agony. The freezing steel handcuffs violently snapped shut over his blistered skin, the sharp metal edges scraping directly against his raw, burnt flesh. The pain was blinding, shooting up his arms like electricity, but he knew any form of physical resistance would only confirm their horrible bias. They dragged his heavy frame off the ground and shoved him roughly toward the back of a patrol car. As they forced him into the cramped, cold back seat, Arthur locked eyes with his weeping daughter through the window. Despite the searing, unbearable pain in his hands and the crushing weight of public humiliation, he forced a warm, gentle smile onto his face. He nodded slowly, projecting a silent promise to Lily that everything would be okay. The heavy car door slammed shut, separating him from the only thing he loved in this world. Sitting in the dark, caged like a murderer, Arthur couldn't understand it. Why were they targeting him so aggressively? Why weren't they investigating the actual crash site before putting him in chains? But what he didn't know was that his death sentence had already been written just a block away. While everything was in chaos at the scene, a sleek black luxury sports car sat idling quietly in the deep shadows of a narrow alleyway overlooking the smoking crash site. Inside the plush leather cabin, a wealthy young man watched the flashing red and blue police lights with a look of pure venom. The sharp clink of a gold-plated Zippo lighter echoed in the quiet car. He lit an expensive cigarette, his manicured hands shaking slightly with suppressed violent rage. This was supposed to be a perfectly clean job. The female officer had been digging too deeply into his illegal underground syndicate. She had found the shipping logs. He had intentionally rammed her cruiser off the road, ensuring a fiery wreck that would destroy her and all the evidence she had gathered. She was supposed to burn to ashes, but then that fat, disgusting garbage truck driver had to play hero. Because of his reckless interference, the officer was still breathing. If she woke up in the hospital and talked, the rich young man's entire criminal empire would crumble overnight. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He needed a scapegoat. Fast. His cold eyes scanned the chaotic scene below, finally landing on the massive rusted garbage truck parked haphazardly across the icy road. A cruel, highly calculated smirk crept across his face. He understood exactly how the world worked. People always believed what they wanted to see, and a giant, unkempt sanitation worker was the perfect, terrifying villain for their narrative. He pulled out a secure, untraceable satellite phone from his designer jacket and dialed 911. "Emergency dispatcher, what is your emergency?" a calm voice answered. The young man instantly altered his voice, breathing heavily to mimic sheer panic. "You have to send help immediately. I just saw the whole thing from my apartment window. That garbage truck driver, he's completely crazed. I saw him intentionally ram the police cruiser off the road. He forced her into the ditch and then tried to drag her out of the fire to finish the job. He wanted to kill her." "Sir, calm down. Can I get your name?" He hung up, tossing the satellite phone onto the passenger seat with a hollow thud. The fake call had lasted less than 52 seconds, but it was more than enough to completely bury the rest of an innocent father's life. 1 hour later, the stale, suffocating smell of old coffee and cold sweat filled the tiny, windowless interrogation room at the central precinct. Arthur sat heavily in a metal chair that groaned under his massive weight. His blistered, bleeding hands were tightly cuffed to a steel ring bolted to the center of the table. He hadn't been given any medical treatment. The burns were beginning to fester. The heavy metal door swung open with a loud creak. A rigid chief inspector walked in, his face set in a permanent judging scowl. He slammed a thick manila file onto the metal table, the sound echoing loudly in the small room. "I need to call my daughter," Arthur said immediately, his voice hoarse and raspy from inhaling the toxic smoke. "She's out there all alone. Please, just let me make sure she's safe." "You don't get to make demands." "Garbage man," the inspector sneered, looking Arthur up and down with blatant, undisguised disgust. The inspector had already listened to the anonymous witness's frantic call. Combined with Arthur's massive, imposing physical figure and dirty, blood-stained clothes, the detective's mind was completely made up. "I didn't do anything wrong," Arthur pleaded, trying desperately to keep his composure. "I was just driving my route. I saw the crash happen right in front of me. I pulled her out before the car exploded." The inspector let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Pulled her out? Is that what you call it? We have a highly credible witness who saw your 20-ton truck intentionally ram her cruiser off the icy road." "That's a lie," Arthur yelled, his massive muscles tensing as the heavy chains rattled aggressively against the table. The inspector leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "We checked the asphalt. There are massive, fresh skid marks exactly where your truck swerved into her lane. Your massive tires matched the trajectory perfectly." Arthur's heart sank into his stomach, the skid marks. When he slammed his heavy boots on the brakes to protect Lily from the initial crash, the heavy garbage truck had skidded wildly across the black ice, creating the exact marks the inspector was talking about. To the police, it looked like a premeditated vehicular attack. To Arthur, it was simply a father's act of protection. The inspector shook his head, his tone dripping with absolute condescension. "Look at yourself, a huge, sloppy mess of a man who can't hold down a real job." Do you really think any judge or jury in this city is going to believe you over a credible, terrified citizen? You're a violent thug, and you're going to rot in a cell for the rest of your miserable life." Arthur bit his lower lip so hard he tasted copper. The verbal insult cut far deeper than the severe burns on his hands. He forced himself to endure it. If he lost his temper now, if he showed even an ounce of aggression, he would prove their horrible bias right. He desperately racked his tired brain, trying to remember if anyone else had seen him pull the officer from the wreckage. Was there a traffic camera? Another driver in the fog? But as the inspector continued to scoff and belittle his every word, a terrifying, paralyzing truth settled over Arthur like a suffocating blanket. The real attacker was out there, successfully pulling the strings of the entire police department, and Arthur had absolutely no evidence to defend himself. 2 agonizing hours later, the harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the city hospital blinded Arthur. He was shoved into a small, glass-walled isolation room just down the hall from the intensive care unit. Through the reinforced glass, he could see little Lily sitting on a hospital bed, being checked by a nurse. She was shivering, clutching her stuffed bear, constantly looking toward Arthur's room with terrified, tear-filled eyes. The rhythmic, haunting beep-beep-beep of the ICU ventilators echoed down the quiet hallway, a grim reminder of the female officer fighting for her life just a few doors away. The heavy door to Arthur's isolation room swung open. The chief inspector marched in, looking even angrier than before. He slammed a crumpled, typewritten document onto the metal table in front of Arthur. "Sign it," the inspector demanded, tossing a cheap pen beside the paper. "It's a full confession. Intentional vehicular assault and attempted murder." "I already told you," Arthur said, his voice raspy but firm. "I didn't do it. I saved her." The inspector leaned in, his face inches from Arthur's. He had reached the end of his patience, and now he was going for the throat. He knew exactly what Arthur's weak point was. "Listen to me very carefully. Garbage man," the inspector hissed, tapping a finger aggressively on the metal table. "If you don't sign this paper right now, I'm making a phone call to Child Protective Services. They are waiting on standby. An obese, homeless-looking thug who can barely afford to feed his kid and who is about to go to federal prison for attacking a cop. You will permanently lose custody of that little girl. She will go into the foster system tonight, and you will never ever see her again." A surge of blind, protective fury erupted in Arthur's chest. For a split second, his massive, chained hands twitched. He wanted to reach across the table and wrap his blistered fingers around the inspector's throat. But then Arthur looked through the glass. He saw Lily. He saw how small and fragile she looked in this cold, cruel world. If he signed the fake confession, he would go to prison forever. Lily would lose him anyway. If he lost his temper and attacked the inspector, he would become the monster they wanted him to be. In the suffocating silence of the room, his late wife's voice echoed in his mind once again. A true hero isn't the man in the spotless uniform. Arthur slowly closed his eyes, swallowing the bitter bile of ultimate humiliation. He was a giant of a man forced to shrink himself down to nothing. He opened his eyes, looking the inspector dead in the face. "I won't sign it," Arthur said quietly, but with an unbreakable resolve. "I won't lie to my daughter. I protected that officer, and I'll protect the truth." The inspector's face turned purple with rage. He snatched the paper off the table. "You just threw her life away. CPS is on their way." But just when Arthur thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, a well-dressed figure casually strolled into the hospital corridor. It was the wealthy young man. He had come to the hospital to play the role of the brave, concerned witness, providing an official statement to the detectives on duty. As the inspector stormed out of the isolation room, the young man walked past. He stopped right in front of the glass wall, looking directly at Arthur. A sickening, arrogant smirk crept across his face. He knew Arthur was watching. The young man then turned to the officers in the hall and began speaking loudly, ensuring Arthur could hear every lie. "I'm just so glad I was there to call you guys," the young man said smoothly, acting perfectly shaken. That massive guy, he looked like a cold-blooded monster. The way he rammed her car, it was pure evil. I thought he was going to tear her apart. Every police officer in the hallway turned to glare at Arthur through the glass with extreme, unadulterated hatred. Several officers instinctively rested their hands on their holstered weapons, ready to use lethal force if the giant dared to move. Arthur sat perfectly still, his eyes tracking the young man. As the villain shifted his weight to play the victim, Arthur's sharp gaze dropped to the floor. The young man was wearing a pair of incredibly expensive, custom-made alligator leather shoes. But they weren't perfect. The tip of the right shoe was severely scorched, the expensive leather melted and blistered by extreme heat. And just above the scorch mark, there was a thick, dark stain of black fluid. Arthur's eyes widened slightly. As a truck driver who spent his entire life working around heavy machinery, he knew exactly what that stain was. It wasn't just dirt, it was high-viscosity synthetic motor oil. Specifically, it was the exact color and consistency of the oil used in the heavy-duty engines of city patrol cars. When Arthur had pulled the female officer from the wreckage at 5 a.m., he had noticed the cruiser's oil pan had ruptured, spilling that exact thick, black oil all over the freezing asphalt near the driver's side. The pieces instantly clicked together in Arthur's mind. The only way someone could have gotten a scorch mark and that specific motor oil on their shoe was if they had been standing right next to the ruptured, burning police cruiser before Arthur even arrived. This wasn't a witness who saw the crash from an apartment window. This was the man who caused it. Arthur realized he was staring directly at the true mastermind. But the paralyzing reality hit him just as hard. He couldn't say a single word. If he tried to point the finger at a wealthy, well-spoken citizen, the police would just laugh at him. No one was going to believe the desperate conspiracy theory of a fat, dirty garbage man over a heroic witness. The wealthy young man finished his fabricated story, shook the inspector's hand, and turned to leave. He walked away with a victorious strut, fully believing he had completely crushed the insignificant bug that had gotten in his way. But what the arrogant mastermind didn't know was that he was completely unaware of the final gift the female officer had managed to leave behind. "All right, that's enough," the inspector barked, walking back into Arthur's room followed by a hospital nurse. "Take his jacket. It's covered in the victim's blood. We're seizing it as physical evidence of the assault." The nurse looked terrified of Arthur, holding a pair of medical shears with trembling hands. She needed to remove his heavy, high-visibility safety vest to treat the severe burns on his arms. "Stand up," an armed officer commanded, stepping into the room with his hand on his taser. Arthur slowly stood up, the chains rattling. The officers roughly grabbed his collar and forcefully stripped the heavy, soot-stained safety vest off his massive shoulders. To Arthur, that vest was more than just clothing, it was the uniform that put food on Lily's table. Now it was being treated as the ultimate proof of his guilt. "Check the pockets," the inspector ordered. "Guys like this always carry a weapon or narcotics. Let's add possession to his charges before CPS gets here to take the kid." An officer sneered, aggressively digging his gloved hands into the deep, foul-smelling front pockets of Arthur's vest, desperate to find anything to permanently bury him. Arthur had nothing left to protect him. Stripped of his heavy jacket, wearing only a torn, sweat-soaked undershirt, his extreme poverty and vulnerability were fully exposed to the disgusted stares of the entire hospital staff. He slowly closed his eyes, bowing his heavy head in defeat, waiting for the final, unjust sentence to crash down on him. But instead of pulling out a bag of drugs, the searching officer's fingers suddenly stopped. He had brushed against something buried deep in the very bottom of the breast pocket. It wasn't a weapon, it was something cold, hard, and incredibly small, and it was slippery with fresh blood. The searching officer slowly pulled his hand out of Arthur's pocket, holding a tiny black square object between his gloved fingers. It was a digital SD memory card completely smeared in the critically injured female officer's fresh blood. The wealthy young man, who had been strutting toward the exit, froze dead in his tracks. His face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. Pure panic flashed in his cold eyes. He knew exactly what that SD card was. "He's a looter!" the young man suddenly shouted, rushing back down the hallway, pointing a manicured finger at Arthur. "Look at him! He didn't just attack her. He robbed her while she was dying in the wreckage. That's stolen evidence. You need to lock that away immediately." The inspector sneered in disgust, fully buying the young man's fabricated outrage. "Bag it for evidence," the inspector told his subordinate, his voice dripping with contempt. "We'll add theft and evidence tampering to his massive list of charges. Put it in a sealed envelope. I'll log it into the precinct vault myself." Arthur's heart pounded against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He realized exactly what was happening. If that bloody memory card went into a sealed police envelope, it would disappear forever. A man with the young man's immense wealth and corrupt underground connections could easily bribe a clerk to destroy it before it ever saw a courtroom. Arthur's only chance to prove his innocence and save his daughter from foster care was about to be locked away. "No!" Arthur roared, his deep, thunderous voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls. He remembered it clearly now. When he was tearing the crushed metal door off the burning cruiser, he had seen a standard-issue body camera clipped to the female officer's uniform. The violent impact of the crash must have shattered the plastic camera housing, dropping the tiny SD card into the folds of her uniform, which then slipped directly into his massive breast pocket when he carried her body, shielding her from the explosion. "Plug it in," Arthur yelled, violently fighting against the heavy steel handcuffs. "You have to look at it right now. That's her body cam footage." "Shut him up!" the inspector barked. 3 armed officers instantly tackled Arthur. They slammed his massive 300-pound frame face first onto the freezing, hard ceramic tiles of the hospital floor. The brutal impact drove the breath from his lungs. The sharp tiles scraped painfully against his raw, severe burns, causing fresh blood to seep rapidly through his bandages. An officer drove a heavy knee squarely between Arthur's shoulder blades, pinning him down like a rabid animal. "I said look at it!" Arthur choked out, his cheek pressed flat against the cold floor, refusing to give up his fight for the truth. A curious young rookie officer, standing near the portable investigation desk, hesitated. He looked at the screaming, well-dressed wealthy man, then looked down at the desperate, bleeding giant pinned to the floor. Against the inspector's direct orders, the rookie grabbed a precinct laptop, inserted the bloody SD card into the reader, and clicked open the only video file. "I got to pause right here. Before we see what's on that SD card, comment down below what you think is going to happen next. Let me know if you think the truth will finally come out." The sharp, high-definition video filled the laptop screen, casting a flickering orange glow across the hospital hallway. The audio kicked in with a deafening screech of tires. It was the female officer's first-person point of view from exactly 5 a.m. The video clearly showed the sleek, black luxury sports car intentionally swerving across the icy lanes, violently ramming the police cruiser off the road. The camera tumbled wildly as the cruiser flipped, ultimately coming to a rest upside down. Through the shattered windshield, the body cam clearly captured the wealthy young man stepping out of his sports car. It recorded his cold, calculating face in perfect clarity as he sparked his gold-plated Zippo lighter and callously tossed it toward the leaking gas tank. Then, the video showed a massive dark figure charging straight into the raging inferno. The entire hospital hallway went dead silent. Even the officers pinning Arthur to the floor stopped breathing, their eyes glued to the screen. The body cam footage didn't just expose the young man as a ruthless, calculating murderer. It showed a tight high-definition close-up of Arthur's soot-covered, sweating face. It recorded the agonizing, raw sound of Arthur's primal grunt as he used superhuman strength to rip a crushed, armored steel door off its hinges with his bare hands. It showed his blistered, smoking fingers gently unbuckling the officer's seatbelt and wrapping his massive arms around her, shielding her fragile body with his own, as the massive shockwave of the explosion tore through the background. The horrifying irony crashed down on the entire police force like a physical weight. The vicious monster they were currently crushing against the cold ceramic floor was the absolute savior who had literally walked through fire to bring their comrade back from the dead. In exchange for sacrificing his own flesh to save one of theirs, they had battered, humiliated, and nearly destroyed him, entirely based on how he looked. The officers, who were pinning Arthur to the floor, immediately realized what they were doing. Their faces flushed with deep, burning shame, they hastily scrambled off him, their hands shaking as they backed away from the giant they had just brutalized. They looked down at his bleeding wrists, the tight handcuffs aggressively cutting into his blistered flesh, and realized they had treated a guardian angel like a demon simply because of his frayed clothes. The wealthy young man, who had just been aggressively playing the righteous, credible witness, began to violently tremble. The color completely drained from his arrogant face. He slowly took a step backward, desperately trying to retreat toward the hospital's emergency exit doors. The chief inspector slowly turned his head. He looked away from the laptop screen and locked eyes with the young man. The inspector's gaze shifted from respectful deference to the absolute, terrifying fury of a law enforcement officer who realized he had been played for an absolute fool. "Stop him," the inspector ordered, his voice dangerously low and calm. The young man spun around and bolted in blind panic. But in his frantic attempt to flee, his expensive alligator leather shoes slipped wildly on the freshly waxed hospital floor. He pitched forward, crashing hard onto the cold linoleum. As he hit the ground, his prized possession, the heavy gold-plated Zippo lighter he had used to ignite the crash, slipped from his designer jacket pocket. It clattered loudly across the floor, spinning end over end until it stopped directly at the tip of the inspector's heavy tactical boot. "Do you know who my father is?" The young man shrieked from the floor, his arrogant facade crumbling into pathetic, weeping desperation. He kicked his legs, trying to scramble away like a coward. "You can't touch me. I'm calling my lawyers. I'll have all your badges. I'll buy this entire department." The inspector didn't say a single word in response. He simply unclipped his own heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He marched forward, grabbing the young man by his expensive silk collar, and violently wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp mechanical click-click-click-click of the cuffs, locking tight, echoed through the hallway. The sheer arrogance of immense wealth and power was instantly, completely crushed by the undeniable force of iron justice. The true villain had finally paid the ultimate price, and the absolute truth was safely out in the open. But what about the battered, soot-stained hero who was still bleeding on the floor? The young rookie officer, still trembling from the adrenaline and shame, immediately scrambled toward Arthur. He reached down with a small key and carefully, almost gently, unlocked the heavy steel handcuffs digging into Arthur's bloody wrists. The soft, metallic click of the cuffs releasing sounded like the breaking of a terrible curse. The chief inspector didn't say a word to his subordinates. He simply walked over to the massive garbage man, completely ignoring the soot and filth, and extended his own hand. With a firm, respectful grip, the inspector personally helped the 300-pound giant stand back up from the cold ceramic floor. Just as Arthur found his footing, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. A team of exhausted doctors wheeled out a mobile hospital bed. It was the female officer. She was battered, bruised, and hooked up to several IV bags, but she was alive. She was stable. Despite her extreme weakness, she weakly raised a heavily bandaged hand. She weakly gestured toward the crowd of officers, silently asking to see the man who had pulled her from the fire. Without a single command being given, the entire police force in the hallway automatically stepped back. They pressed themselves against the sterile walls, respectfully clearing a wide, silent path for the obese, soot-stained garbage man to step forward. Arthur slowly limped toward the bed, his massive frame towering over the medical staff. He looked down at the officer, his chest heaving with emotion. She didn't speak, but her tear-filled eyes looked up at him with an overwhelming, profound gratitude that transcended words. She knew exactly what he had sacrificed for her. The chief inspector stepped forward, stopping right beside Arthur. The rigid, arrogant man who just minutes ago had brutally insulted Arthur's poverty and appearance now did the unthinkable. In front of his entire squad, and all the doctors and nurses, the chief inspector bowed deeply, bending a full 90 degrees at the waist. "I am so deeply sorry," the inspector said, his voice thick with genuine, overwhelming regret. "We were blind, we judged you by your clothes, and we treated a hero like a criminal. You saved one of our own today. This precinct and this city owes you a debt we can never repay." Arthur stood silently for a moment, looking at the bowing inspector. Then a slow, strained smile crept across Arthur's soot-stained face. But unlike the painful, humiliating smiles he had forced himself to wear his entire life just to survive, this smile was different. It was a smile of genuine, profound peace. "I don't want any debts," Arthur replied softly, his deep voice carrying a quiet dignity. "I just want my safety vest back. I need to go pick up my daughter." In that transcendent moment, not a single person in the hospital corridor saw a smelly, obese garbage man. They didn't see his poverty or his frayed undershirt. Standing before them was a towering giant of a man with an unbreakable spirit and a heart of absolute gold. The deep, heavy burden of hatred and physical insecurity that had crushed Arthur's soul for years simply melted away, burned to ash by the fires he had walked through. Arthur slowly turned and limped into the hospital's main waiting area. Sitting alone on a plastic chair was 6-year-old Lily. She was crying softly, her tiny hands clutching her stuffed teddy bear against her chest. "Lily," Arthur called out, his voice cracking with emotion. The little girl's head snapped up. When she saw her father, her tear-filled eyes widened. Arthur immediately dropped to one knee, instinctively reaching out his massive arms to hug her. But just as his hands moved forward, he froze. He looked down at his own body. He was covered in dried blood, thick black motor oil, foul-smelling garbage water, and layers of toxic soot. A brief, painful flash of his old insecurity flared up. He was too filthy. He was afraid he would ruin her perfectly clean, bright pink dress. He started to pull his blistered hands back in shame. But the 6-year-old girl didn't care about the filth. She didn't see the blood or the dirt. "Daddy!" Lily screamed, bursting into tears of pure joy. She ran across the room and launched her tiny body directly into her father's massive soot-stained chest. She wrapped her small, delicate arms as far around his 300-pound frame as she could, burying her face into his filthy, sweat-soaked undershirt. Arthur completely broke down. He burst into heavy, shaking sobs, wrapping his severely blistered, bandaged arms tightly around his precious little angel. Hot, stinging tears rolled rapidly down his smoke-stained cheeks, washing away the dirt in clean, clear streaks. The acrid, burnt smell of toxic soot mixed perfectly with the sweet, gentle scent of Lily's baby shampoo. The agonizing inferiority complex that had haunted Arthur every single day since his wife's passing was finally, permanently shattered. He might not have a noble, respected job. He might not have a perfect, athletic body. But as he held his crying daughter against his massive chest, none of that mattered. In the pure, innocent eyes of that little girl, he was the only superhero she would ever need. The following morning, the storm had finally passed. The sky above the city was a brilliant, crystal-clear blue. Arthur, wearing his torn, soot-stained high-visibility vest once again, slowly pushed open the heavy glass doors of the hospital. He held Lily's tiny hand firmly in his own, the bright morning sunlight washing over them, symbolizing the beautiful new beginning they had fought so hard to earn. But as they stepped out onto the concrete pavement, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. Right outside the hospital gates, lining both sides of the long entrance walkway, stood 2 perfectly straight rows of police officers. There were dozens of them, all dressed in their immaculate, formal dress uniforms. As the massive, limping garbage man and his little girl began to walk down the path, a sharp command rang out through the crisp morning air. Simultaneously, the sharp, unified snap of heavy boot heels clicking together echoed loudly across the courtyard. Every single officer in the 2 long rows raised their hands to their foreheads in a crisp, perfect military salute. The morning sunlight gleamed beautifully off the silver badges on their chests and sparkled against the torn, dirty, reflective stripes of Arthur's garbage vest. It was the absolute highest honor, the ultimate tribute, paid to the lowest, most invisible man in society. As Arthur walked through the guard of honor, tears welling in his eyes once more, his late wife's words finally rang completely true. A true hero isn't the man in the spotless, tailored uniform. It's the one who is willing to burn his own hands to save a life when everyone else is walking away. Never judge a book by its cover, and never ever despise the quiet, invisible people working the dirtiest jobs on your streets. Because sometimes, when the world catches fire, those nameless, soot-stained workers are the only guardian angels brave enough to step into the flames. A few months later, the sterile silence of the hospital was replaced by the heavy, echoing oak walls of the city courthouse. The wealthy young man stood before the judge's bench. He wasn't wearing his custom-tailored silk suits or alligator leather shoes anymore. He was stripped of all his manufactured dignity, trembling in a cheap, oversized orange prison jumpsuit. His family's immense wealth, his high-priced lawyers, and his corrupt connections were completely useless against the undeniable, high-definition body cam footage that had been broadcasted across the entire country. The sharp, heavy crack of the judge's wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot. Guilty on all charges: attempted murder, vehicular assault, and evidence tampering. He was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs aggressively grabbed his arms to drag him away, the young man didn't scream about who his father was. He didn't make empty threats. The arrogant, untouchable smirk was gone forever, replaced only by the hollow, empty terror of a man who realized his money couldn't buy his way out of hell. Justice had finally caught up to him. Outside the courtroom, the city continued its busy rhythm under the bright, warm sun. In a world obsessed with shiny exteriors and bank accounts, it is so incredibly easy to overlook the quiet giants walking among us. People are often judged by the dirt on their boots, the fray of their collars, and the size of their wallets. But Arthur's story proves that true wealth isn't measured in gold or sports cars. It is measured by the courage it takes to run into the flames when everyone else is running away. So the next time you see a sanitation worker, a janitor, or anyone doing the heavy, dirty lifting to keep your world spinning, take a second to look a little closer. Give them the respect they have earned. Because you never know when the person you look down on today might just be the superhero who saves your life tomorrow. If Arthur's story touched your heart, please share this video with someone you love. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories like this one, and leave a comment down below. What would you have done if you were in Arthur's shoes? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.